An Kwong turned 16 today. There was a huge smile on his face as he imagined the gift he was promised. He vigorously worked with his father in the fields, excited to reach back home and celebrate with his family. He wanted to get sweets for his little sister on his way back home. His hands and feet were all muddy. An could feel the cold breeze that swept through his hair and the wet mud under his feet. Suddenly, An heard a loud noise, so loud that it left a ringing sound in his ears. An fell to his knees. He looked around for his father, but till then, a troop of armed men was pointing their guns towards him. The loud shouting of the soldiers merged with the ringing in his ears. An's father looked at his son for the last time, and with a loud thud of gunfire. An's heart sank so deep that he wanted it to stop beating at all. An fell to the ground. As he fell, Xian Yinghao, the Chinese soldier from the troop, saw An as his whole body shivered with fear and disbelief. An looked at Xian in the hope that he would kill him. The pain and terror he felt will be over, but Xian looked in An's eyes and moved on. An lay there still. Not a shriek left his mouth, however his eyes could not hold back the tears. After gathering some courage, An crawled towards his father, and he laid his head on his chest in hopes to hear a faint heartbeat, but it was utter silence. An lifted his father's lifeless corpse on his frail shoulders and carried him through streets which have been decimated. An could hear shrieks of little kids from the rubble of their houses. As he reached home, he saw there was no entrance to it. It seemed like the Chinese army only left shadows of the life which once existed in that little Vietnamese village. An lays the body of his father on the doorstep and begins to help the families who still have someone to live for. Xian followed the orders of his officials as it was the holy word of the Almighty. He believed that he was a good soldier, and for him, it's an honor to be a part of this war. He wanted to be a wartime hero rather than a peacetime soldier. But he saw most soldiers like him die in obscurity. Some froze to death, some starved to death, some drowned in the river, some were bitten to death by dogs, and some died of disease. All this made him believe that his fate would be no different. He would be forgotten, and his family won't even get his body to mourn his death, so he at times allowed his conscience to take over his sense of duty. That's what happened when he saw An. On the website of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the overview of China-Vietnam relations only mentions that the relations went downhill between the 1980s and the 1990s, but does not specify the reasons behind the hiatus. Nor does it mention the Sino-Vietnamese War that took place in 1979 and lasted for a month. So it's obvious that they don't want to remember it, but that does not change that each side suffered roughly 30,000 deaths. 30,000 people died in a war that their country did not even own. So the question arises, why did it happen? Why so many suffered and died suffering? Why does all this chaos take place? Vietnam went through two major conflicts that devastated its economy to its core. The Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975, and then the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. The nation's economic infrastructure had been destroyed by war, and unfortunately for Vietnam, the country was one of the poorest on the planet with communist 5-year plans, fixed pricing, and a focus on collectivized agriculture, which meant the peasants were forced to give up their individual farms and join large collective farms under the control of a single entity. So it did not exactly spring a great economic awakening for a long period, as the farmers were miserable and could hardly make enough to survive. After Vietnam struggled for a decade trying to survive as a communist nation by the mid-80s, Vietnam's stagnant economy was barely scraping, and it had become clear that full-blown communism wasn't living up to the expectations. But wait. Things finally started to change for this war-torn country. Doi Moi, the savior reform for the Vietnamese population. It was a game changer. The 1986 Doi Moi reform was a broad economic transformation focused on dismantling a controlled economy and opening up a closed system to international trade. The main focus was on agriculture, and this makes perfect sense considering a staggering 70% of the workforce worked in the fields. The reforms moved away from collectivization and towards individual farming for a profit, where farmers were free to set their own price and keep any profits, which quickly led to a dramatic improvement in agricultural production. However, the reforms didn't stop at agriculture. As stabilizing the economy took center stage, inefficient government monopolies or state-owned enterprises were scaled down from over 12,000 in 1989 to less than 600 in 2016 through multiple rounds of restructuring sell-offs and mergers. This all went hand in hand with reforms to encourage private businesses. A key outcome of this whole process of reform has been the seemingly unstoppable rise of Vietnam's exports, which basically tripled over the last decade. Since 1990, over the course of 30 years, Vietnam's GDP per capita went from $95 to over $2,700, despite its population growing by a quarter even after accounting for inflation. Vietnam experienced a fourfold increase over this same period. The poverty rate has dropped from 60% to less than 5%, with the nation becoming a leading exporter. As a result, Vietnam's economy has become the poster child for economic development. No doubt Vietnam won the Sino-Vietnamese War with only 70,000 soldiers against 200,000 Chinese soldiers. Yes, you heard right. China lost the war with a manpower of 200,000 soldiers. But why did China go through so much chaos, lose miserably, and still become the second largest economy in the world? Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader at the time of the war, was a highly rational leader who understood the art of strategy. He knew that if any plans to reform were to succeed, it might have to be on the back of failure. He had particular concerns about the state of his armed forces, whose effectiveness and competence he doubted. And if that were the case, then failure needed to be managed. A tightly managed war would provide him with the control he needed to bring about the reform he wanted. The guy had two major goals: consolidate his power as a leader and bring about domestic modernization and military reform. And so he did. China was being squeezed both from the north by the Soviet Union at the height of its military power and to the south, where Vietnam was steadily gaining strength under the guardianship of its Soviet partner. Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia to limit Chinese influence there was seen as ingratitude for the economic and military assistance China had given to Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Thus, China wanted to teach Vietnam a lesson and flaunt its power in front of the whole world. The alliance between Vietnam and Moscow and the Soviet-led rallying of other countries to encircle China meant Deng confronted the real possibility of a future war on two fronts. What he wanted was to create a secure international environment in order to conduct domestic reform. Deng's plan was to teach Vietnam a lesson while minimizing the possibility of a wider conflict or serious engagement with the Soviet Union. It was here that Deng's strength as a strategist came to the fore. He calculated that provided his own military objectives were modest, the Soviet Union would not be inclined to move forces committed to Europe. A short war would also limit the cost while being sufficient to teach Vietnam the lesson it needed. Deng's plan was pretty straight: humiliate Vietnam, avoid war with the Soviets, and consolidate power in China. But did it go as planned? Not really. Deng's generals attacked with over 200,000 troops across the Vietnamese border with the intention of capturing 6 regional capitals in a few days. Dreamed big, didn't they? Thus, this is where it all went downhill. The 50,000 opposing Vietnamese were highly skilled in guerrilla combat and gained a lot of experience in wars in Cambodia and against the Americans. The Chinese tactics were outdated, and their forces suffered from poor levels of organization and inadequate logistics. The military campaign was certainly not the quick and easy victory expected, but Deng did not view victory as everyone else did. Chinese forces withdrew in relatively good order and announced that Vietnam had been taught a lesson. Ironic? Definitely. However, it served the purpose. Deng's influence increased considerably, and following the failure of the military, there could be no argument against the reforms he wanted being made. A younger, more loyal generation of senior soldiers would now shape the Chinese military. Fast forward to today, China ranks third among the most powerful militaries in the world. the Chinese began to build the indigenous military-industrial complexes it relies upon today. Out of necessity grew a military economic capability that allows China an independence of strategic capability probably second only to the United States. In a world where failures of strategy surround us, the leadership of Deng is striking. Of course, some of it did not work as it should, but Deng allowed China to reach where it is today. Now coming back to the question, why does all this chaos take place? Going through so much agony, suffering, and death, is it necessary? All of us, you, me, this world, everything is a byproduct of chaos. 13.8 billion years back at the beginning of times, the occurrence of the Big Bang took place in the universe. There is neither matter nor energy around us as we know them, and at the time, the tiniest change in any point of the germinating universe is capable of changing its future completely. Whatever the reason for this tiny change, it appears that our reality was literally born actually thanks to chaos. Have you ever heard the statement, one flap of a butterfly's wing in Brazil would be enough to cause a hurricane in Indonesia? Edward Norton Lorenz. In 1945, a special U.S. Army committee made a list of priority targets for atomic bombings. On August 9th, the crew of the U.S. Air Force B-29 bomber was given a specially important order by the commanders. The military arsenal in Kokura must be razed to the ground. The first atomic bomb more powerful than any used before is loaded on board the aircraft for the mission. However, when the aircraft reached their destination, the town miraculously got enveloped in a fog so thick that the crew failed to distinguish the target. The aircraft captain decided to keep flying and decided to drop the bomb on the town of Fly on Nagasaki. The fate of thousands of lives, little children and families, decided by one man. So is chaos just a scary word for fate? Then it means that chaos is inevitable. So there is absolutely nothing we can do to avoid chaos rather than treat it as a source of growth. Amor fati, translated as love of fate from Latin, was a concept introduced by Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wanted us to embrace one's destiny, not merely as acceptance, but as a genuine love and affirmation of every detail of existence. Nietzsche explains, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. One must not merely bear what is necessary nor conceal it, but love it." It is a call to view every twist of fate, every joy and sorrow, as a part of one's existence. Nietzsche's philosophy encourages individuals to see their lives as a work of art, a book being written, a song being composed with each experience, word or note contributes to the creation of a richer and more meaningful narrative. We rush to improve things ourselves, politics, the economy, and the course of history. We refuse to accept the course of fate the way it naturally flows. In the face of life's unpredictability, Nietzsche's amor fati serves as a guiding principle for cultivating resilience and serenity. It allows us to cultivate an inner strength that helps us endure the hardships of life. We need to make our peace with the fact that just because you want to do something doesn't mean you get to do it. Life is chaos, success is completely arbitrary, and confidence is everything. So in order to thrive in this chaos, let's delve into the idea of Übermensch. Nietzsche introduced the concept of the Übermensch, roughly translated to overman or superman. Yes, the savior who is always right on time saves us from disasters and protects us from evil. Quite the opposite. Nietzsche believed that Christianity, or the idea of savior, emerged in the Roman Empire in the minds of slaves and the powerless, who failed to achieve what they really wanted in their lives and thus started to justify their misery using religion as a crutch. Surrendering to misery means you have learned to live your life in anguish and despair. Thus, the idea of Übermensch defies the prevailing values of the time, particularly the herd mentality and the limitations imposed by society. He understands and accepts that life, with all its joys and sufferings, is utter chaos. Everything is random, and no one can change that. Thus, they confront life's challenges with an unwavering spirit, rather than succumbing to the chaos. Nietzsche's Übermensch molds its values and determines its purpose beyond the constraints of tradition and external influences, liberated from the shackles of societal morality, shaping values according to their unique essence, the essence one is born with. Übermensch is not a static ideal, but a dynamic process of continual personal and collective development. Nietzsche envisions a humanity that continually strives to surpass the randomness of life and emerge stronger and better. In the time when our minds feel numb and nothing seems to go the way it is supposed to, what was taught to us, what we believed in was a lie. Our hope is shattered and our hearts are heavy as mountain rocks. We need to embrace the suffering and make a new way out of this fog of despair. An lost his family, and Xi'an lost his trust in the sovereignty of his country, and when they were stripped of the reasons they lived for, they found a new one. They followed their essence and allowed their hearts to hope again. So maybe, chaos is necessary to discover our true selves. Or is it? Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, says he has defeated poverty, but discussion of economic struggle is forbidden. The government of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, guided by a totalitarian ideology under the absolute rule of the Chinese Communist Party, deprives citizens of their rights and systematically limits freedom of speech or to live as a way to retain power. A retired old woman in China receives only 100 yuan, or $14.50 as her pension, which is the sole source of income for her, and when she shows, the groceries she was able to buy in such a limited amount breaks one's heart. However, the video was instantly removed from all social media websites by the government. Because Xi Jinping in 2021 declared a comprehensive victory in the battle against poverty, yet many people remain poor or live just above the poverty line. Local governments usually chase beggars and homeless people off the streets. Thus, they become invisible in big cities like Beijing. Chinese leaders like to brush minor inconveniences under the carpet, just like Deng Xiaoping did in the Sino-Vietnamese War when they sent 200,000 soldiers to war just so he could consolidate his own power. What do you think? Is chaos necessary for our growth, or the destruction it brings with itself is forever irreversible?